is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
They die all the time at the crossing. A stampede, a capsizing boat, or sometimes in the hands of overzealous law enforcement officers. But they keep coming like a floodgate. A recent incident of African migrants trying to cross from Morocco into Spain left at least 23 dead and 76 seriously injured. The tragedy occurred when about 2,000 migrants tried to cross the high wire fence separating Melilla from the northern Moroccan border town of Nador. The incident sparked outrage and a flurry of condemnation by rights groups. Both the United Nations and the African Union expressed their shock and called for an immediate independent investigation. Yet after years and thousands of lives lost in similar attempts at the crossing, there are still no signs of an end to the desperation. This week on Talk Africa, we examine the deepening Mediterranean Sea migrant crisis, who should be held accountable for the needless deaths, and what can be done to stem the tide. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. And we have a lot to discuss on African migrants. So let's now bring in our panel of guests, all joining us via Zoom. Joining us from Johannesburg, Professor Lauren Landau, Senior Research Professor at the University of the Wits African Center for Migration and Society. He's also co-director of the Wits Oxford Mobility Governance Lab. In Brussels, Catherine Willard, Director at the European Council of Refugees and Exiles. And in Barcelona, Ousmane Umar, author and founder of NASCO Feeding Minds. A warm welcome to you all and thank you for joining us in this discussion. Catherine, let me start off with you first, because Europe is living through a maritime refugee crisis of historic proportions. It is evolving. Response has become one of the continent's defining challenges of the 21st century. First off, what is the real gravity of the situation?
The situation is that we see widespread violence and violations of human rights taking place at the EU's borders. And this is part of the efforts of European countries to try to prevent people arriving regardless of the cost and consequences. So this leads to humanitarian crises and tragedies, such as the recent incident in Melilla at the border between Morocco and the Spanish enclaves, where 23 people at least were killed as they tried to cross a border. What provokes this is the record number of refugees that exist in the world, over 100 million people, but also continuing inequalities between regions, which also force people to try to migrate.
Right. When we look at what has happened to the Ukrainian refugees, for instance, you know, they arrived on European borders, but they were given, you know, temporary preferential treatment in terms of when it comes to education, you know, housing, medical assistance. Why is that?
So what we saw with the response to displacement from Ukraine is a very positive response from Europe and from the European Union. In fact, it's almost the complete opposite of what we usually see. So in this case, people were allowed to cross borders. There was access to territory at the borders. People were given a protection status, a temporary protection status, right, automatically. In other cases, people have to apply and wait many years, and there's an attempt to deny them protection status. In addition, onward movement across Europe was encouraged or even facilitated for people fleeing from Ukraine, whereas for other people, that kind of onward movement is penalized, punished, or discouraged at very least. So we see the opposite response, and we know that there are different reasons for that. Of course, one reason is the racial and religious bias that exists within asylum and migration policies, and is something that's long been acknowledged. And there were other reasons as well. The sheer number of people arriving, the closer connection with security and military considerations, and the fear that it would play into the hands of Putin
Right.
if Europe went into its usual panic and paralysis on this issue, and also the proximity to Europe. So there's a range of different reasons for the different response. I think what we would say is let's learn from this and show that Europe can manage people arriving and should offer such a welcome in all cases.
Right. Professor Landa, I want to get your view here. I mean, you've heard from Catherine the different response between the African migrants and, you know, the refugees from other parts of the globe, for instance, the Ukrainian refugees. What's your view here?
I would agree with Catherine that the initial response was enormously positive. And I think what we're seeing, though, is a hardening even now towards the Ukrainians, a recognition that these issues are simply because they're white, simply because they are Christian, they're still refugees, and there are still politics at play in Europe. And what we're seeing here is really Europe trying to resolve its internal conflicts between the left and right, those sort of disagreements that Catherine referred to, by unifying around migrants and trying to draw a boundary around it, trying to reinforce what it means to be Europe. And I think until those issues are resolved, it's unlikely that we're going to see a real shift in the way in which Europe is treating refugees and migrants. Of course, Europe needs migrants, they need labor, they need to welcome people in, but there's a sense that this must be done on European terms, and that is resulting in the tragedies that we're seeing.
When we talk about European terms, Professor Landa, what are European terms?
Clearly, there's some in Europe who would like to see no one come in, but I think what's at the heart of what everyone is trying to preserve is what they would call a kind of European way of life, and they have established a ministry to protect and preserve the European way of life, which I think we should honestly say is one that is oriented towards the rule of law, but is also fundamentally one that is white and that is fundamentally Christian. And I think that kind of desire to preserve that attitude or those sorts of values, or even to promote those sorts of values, is at the heart of what we're seeing across Europe.
Catherine, is that the fundamental position that is driving European migrant policy? The idea to keep it, first of all, as Professor Landau says, white, and secondly, Christian.
That's the case for certain political leaders, and particularly the new generation of extremist, extreme nationalist and overtly racist leaders that we have, unfortunately, in some countries in Europe, and the political parties that represent that extremist position. And I think more generally in Europe, the position is very divided. So, for instance, the majority of the population of Europe actually supports refugees, welcomes refugees, even before the Ukraine crisis. So it's not just linked to a predominantly white movement of people, although we should also note that among Ukrainians there are different ethnic groups. There's 500,000 Roma and other minority communities as well. And even if we look at the wider question of immigration more generally, public opinion surveys show that people in Europe are still open to that. But in recent years, we've also had a very strong vocal segment of the population and certain political parties that are strongly opposed, and they use this issue to stimulate votes. They use this issue to hide other problems, so such as to distract from issues of corruption or rule of law in certain countries. So it's important to understand, I think, all those nuances, and also to insist that other political parties, the mainstream and centre political parties, don't absorb this rhetoric and don't justify these policies by saying it's what the public wants. Actually, often that's not the case.
Right. Ousmane, I want to get your view here because you have a personal experience here. I mean, you took the perilous journey. What do you think about what you've heard so far on this panel, and how bad was it upon your arrival?
When it comes to migration crisis, I didn't just read it from a book or watch it in a movie. I've lived it. I've experienced a terrible experience in my flesh. I still have these scars in my body. My eyebrows, I still have scars in my elbow of the terrible treatment I received in 5 horrible years to cross the whole countries in Africa, in the north of Africa, to be able to get to Europe 17 years ago. It's sad for me to see today that last 2 weeks, the numbers are not clear, the figures are not really clear, but the truth is that it's not about if 23 people have died on that treatment or 37 have died. The question is, what killed them? If this happens, let's just say a protest in any corner of Europe, if this has happened any corner, if there were European citizens, I'm absolutely convinced that there will be all press conferences, media pushing, pressing to get investigation done before burying them, to know what killed them. How comes this police treatment could be so terrible? And it's also sad to say, but the reality is that this treatment that we saw last 2 weeks is not new.
All right.
17 years ago when I came, I experienced it, and most of my friends died. But today there's a mobile phone which was capable to hide and get into that field and capture these images. But this practice have always been in the migration, illegal migration process in the north of Africa.
Let me put that to Catherine. Catherine, Ousmane went through this 17 years ago. Why has nothing changed in the last 17 years?
And it goes back much longer as well. I mean, this goes back decades, and we see this also, the situation in the Mediterranean, deaths at sea, as something dating back decades within Europe. The reasons for this, I think, are various. In terms of accountability and trying to get justice for people who are killed in these circumstances, despite the efforts of many different organizations and institutions, unfortunately, states are operating with a certain impunity when it comes to this. So, for instance, in the particular recent case of Melilla that's just been mentioned that we're discussing, we've seen institutions in both Morocco and Europe calling for investigation. The National Human Rights Council of Morocco, for instance, identifying excessive force and responsibility on the part of the Spanish border guards and also of the Moroccan border guards. Similarly, the European Commissioner for Human Rights of the Council of Europe calling for investigation. Right. But all too often, the state authorities and state agencies that are engaged in these violations are able to avoid justice. So there are lots of efforts to take legal cases, for instance, when there have been these kind of abuses leading to people being beaten, pushed back, or in the worst cases, killed. So I think it's perpetual work across a whole variety of using different tools, from litigation to direct action to protest to political change, to try to change this approach. And yes, to get accountability when violations happen, but ideally to prevent them happening in the first place.
So Ousmane, I want to come back to you and get an understanding, because you went through a terrible situation over 5 years to get to the borders in Europe. When you arrived at the borders in Europe, how were you received?
I arrived with a boat 2 days before. One of the boats have already capsized. Almost 150, 180 people with whom I was flying with died. None of them survived. When we arrived, the police received me. I hadn't stolen anything. I had not committed any crime. My place was in jail. Almost 1.5 months in jail without any explanation. So before that, I also lived in Libya during Muammar Gaddafi dictator. And I promise you, when I arrived in Libya after 3 terrible weeks walking around the Sahara Desert, where out of 46 of us, only 6 survived. In Libya, I wasn't put in jail. Gaddafi didn't put me in jail. When I arrived Spain, the first point I put my feet on Spanish territory, the only place for me was to be in jail.
All right, let me bring in Professor Landau here before we go on a break. There is an issue that Ousmane has mentioned here, and he says Europe is supposed to be, the champions of human rights, but they are, in this instance, the violators of human rights. And he talks about the different, scenarios that he faced in Libya vis-a-vis what he found in Spain. How has this not been addressed?
Europe has always had a standard about how Europeans should be treated, and a different standard for how people across Africa and elsewhere in the world should be treated. If we look at histories of colonialism, imperialism, activities during the Cold War. So in this way, there's really nothing new. I think the other thing to keep in mind is that these deaths are not an accident. These deaths are an important part of the border control apparatus. They are something that the European Union needs to send a message to other Africans. They want to publicize these stories, and they use them in programs that they're funding across the continent to show other Africans what will happen to them if they try to do what Ousmane has done. If they try to leave, you are going to end up in jail. You're going to end up in prison. You might end up drowning. These deaths are part of the mechanism. And so we ask, why have they not stopped? They can't stop, because if people are able to travel safely to Europe, the whole apparatus will start to fall.
For now, we're going to take a short break. When we come back, we will look into Europe's cooperation with Africa on migration and whether it is bearing any fruit, as well as ongoing efforts to address the migration crisis in general. To stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Still with me on the program, Professor Lauren Landau, joining us from Johannesburg, Ousmane Omar and Catherine Willard. Thank you for staying on the program. Catherine, let me just come back with you in regard to the control measures that Europe has put in place, because since the height of the migration crisis in 2015, the EU implemented some sort of external, border controls to stem the migration flows. Have these measures worked at all?
Generally, these measures don't work, but they do cause significant suffering and violations of human rights when they're put in place. One of the attempts to do this was the infamous EU-Turkey deal, which is an agreement with Turkey whereby Turkey prevents people from leaving from Turkey to move on into the EU. And that did reduce the number of people arriving in the EU, specifically in Greece, to seek protection. But it's impossible to completely prevent people from moving, of course. I mean, this is completely unrealistic, and particularly at a time when there are record numbers of people who are in need of international protection. So a lot of these policies are both cruel and futile. We would also argue that in some cases these policies are counterproductive because they involve doing deals or making agreements with leaders in other countries, in other regions, who are themselves perhaps repressive, who may take money from Europe with one hand and money from smugglers with another. So there's a lot of downsides, and from our perspective, we've strongly argued that external cooperation, foreign policy, should be based on trying to tackle the causes of displacement, or not causing displacement in the first place, so right. Not contributing to war, to corruption, to problems, rather than these attempts to capture and use funding, diplomacy and other policies to prevent people from leaving.
Professor Landau, what's your thought here on that issue of, this policies becoming counterproductive? Because the Mediterranean Human Rights Monitor, in a recent report, said that the Europeans' pushback of migrants and criminalizing search and rescue operations are actually compounding the migrant deaths and disappearance. What's your take?
I think what we have to do is look at what work are these doing. And I think that is, as I was mentioning before, the effort to try to invest in these things is a way of externalizing Europe's problems. It's a way of satisfying the far right so that they cannot gain electorally through increased immigration in Europe. And in that sense, they're doing good. They're taking responsibility away from Europe. They're putting it on African states. They're taking away the rights of people who make it to Europe and making it the responsibility of African countries to protect those rights, to preserve those rights, so that Europe doesn't have to deal with this issue. And in that way, it is working extremely well. What it is not doing is stopping migrants. It is not protecting rights, and it cannot address the historical inequalities that are leading people to move. So the idea of addressing the root causes of economic inequality, while we support that, while we should support investment in African economies, it cannot be something that can be won. But that doesn't mean the policies aren't working. We just have to ask ourselves, what is it actually that the Europeans are trying to do?
Ousmane, I mean, you've made that journey yourself. You've talked to your, other people about what you went through, and yet we still see huge numbers trying to cross the Mediterranean. Why haven't the policies stemmed the tide of migration?
In the first place, the policies are not working because we've seen across history that migration is something that have always existed. Let's go back to 1945. How many thousands and millions of Europeans moved to Latin America? How many Italians lived in Argentina today? So let's understand the truth that yes, the solution of migration is something that have always existed. If definitely we really want to solve this problem, the solution is not in the Mediterranean Sea, it's not in Melilla, but rather in the source root of the problem. The solution is in Africa. I founded an organization called NASCO Feeding Minds 10 years ago. I took the responsibility that I'm the president of my community. So it's my responsibility to do something to avoid my people to get fled and get trapped in this terrible welcome that we receive when we get to Europe. I funded a first computer schools.
Right.
10 years ago today, more than 20,000 children have passed through my computer labs. Almost 47 schools are benefiting from the computer lab without any government support. I haven't received even a pin from neither the European governments or African government, just people who get to listen to my story and realize that the solution is in Africa. And definitely today, 14 of these people who I started teaching IT today are in Ghana, working for 8 European companies without going to the Melilla, trying to get back to the bad wire or taking the Mediterranean Sea to come to Europe. There is a way to solve it.
Catherine and Professor Landau, to you both, where does the buck stop here? Because when we look at the recent incident in Melilla, UN Secretary General condemned it and he called it unacceptable. But the Spanish Prime Minister, Pedro Sanchez, who described that incident as an attack on Spain's territorial integrity, he blamed the mafias that traffic in human beings. When Ousmane talks about responsibility, who should be held accountable for this?
It's looking at who the perpetrators are, who are the people who are involved in violation of rights and abuses and holding them to account. And in some cases also we see the trend where Europe kind of outsources responsibility for carrying out preventive actions, for carrying out violations, outsources that to other states or to other actors. So it becomes even more difficult to hold people to account. I think this is the question that was mentioned earlier on in the discussion about the difference between having human rights on paper in charters, in the law across Europe, but then moving to have that in practice. And those rights are universal. So it's regardless of somebody's origins, background, color, or whatever, they should be able to access their rights.
Professor Landau, your view there, who should be held accountable?
I think, as Catherine was suggesting, there's plenty of blame to go around here, whether it's the African states who've signed on to agreements that are about repressing their own citizens, whether it's traffickers, whether it's the European lawmakers or the right-wing politicians. All of these bear a certain responsibility. But I think we have to take a step back and understand, why is it that people are moving? What are the sources of these inequalities? And who is responsible for that? And this is a centuries-long issue in which resources and wealth have been extracted from Africa and taken to Europe, whether that was during colonialism or during the Cold War, in which European and American forces destabilized much of Africa, inserted leaders who were friendly to them, but not necessarily friendly to their populations. And now, surprise, surprise, there's global inequality. And Europe wants to keep it that way because it doesn't want Africans to come and take the wealth that that the Europeans took from them. And so I think that there's a responsibility here that goes beyond the immediate. Yes, the smugglers. Yes, the traffickers. Yes, the border control. Yes, the politicians. But we have to understand that this is part of a historically embedded system of inequality, and stopping immigration is a way of preserving that system. And those people who are benefiting from that system are the ones that are responsible.
Ousmane, what would you give as a solution to this situation? What would you give as a way out for the African migrants trying to cross this perilous journey into Europe?
My mission is feeding people's mind, not their stomach. If we definitely, Europe as a European Commission, we want to fight against, solve this problem, the solution is in the source root, the origin. We definitely need to empower the youth of Africa. They are going to solve their problems in their own countries. I think that our success case, which is the co-founder of our organization called Banasco City Nuhu, the co-founder of NASCO Feeding Minds, who have become the youngest parliamentary candidate in Ghana last 2020 elections, is a real story, a success case that proved that yes, if you give people the right tools, the know-how, they will lead the progress in their own communities without seeking wealth or prosperity outside. The prosperity are back in their own countries.
Professor Landau, you have the final word.
Thank you. I think there's three things that need to happen. One is to recognize that migration is neither unnatural, nor will it stop. Second is to recognize that Europe actually needs large-scale migration in order to meet its labor demands in the future. So if we start from that, it leads us to a third solution, which is how do we address the issue of undocumented and illegal migration? It is by creating legal pathways. This is a crisis that Europe has made. Most African migrants who move stay within Africa. Most have no desire to go to Europe, and Europe needs the people who are coming. So why not open pathways so that people can come legally? And you do that, and we don't need search and rescue. We don't need mass investments in border control across African continent to stop people from moving. Instead, what we can do is spend that same money, probably much less, in making sure people can come and participate and contribute to European society, which needs the very people that they're now trying to keep out.
All right, a very insightful discussion, but that's all we have time for on this edition of the program. A big thank you to our panel of experts. In Johannesburg, Professor Lauren Landau, Senior Research Professor at the University of the Wits African Center for Migration and Society. In Brussels, Catherine Wolland, Director at the European Council of Refugees and Exiles. And in Barcelona, Ousmane Omar, author and founder of NASCO Feeding Minds. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation through our social media platforms on Facebook and Twitter, and do watch this and other editions of the program on our YouTube playlist. To join us again next week for more on Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi, until next time, bye-bye.